Live. All right.
All right.
So before we do anything else, everybody, make sure you can see us and hear us. I'm Sean. And this is Dr. Elizabeth Jackson, known as Liz. She prefers you call her that, so go right ahead and do so.
Absolutely.
And yeah, we just want to make sure before we do anything else that you guys can see and hear everything. So I want to. It's still not showing up on there. What is going on? No, it's showing up on there. All right. Come on now. Come on, YouTube. You can do it. Is it that much latency?
I think it's working, actually.
Okay, you can see it on your end?
Okay. I can see it on my end. Yeah,
there
I haven't heard anyone confirm they can hear us, but I think we're at least live. So
all right. So we'll just pretend like we are. So welcome to Believing Thinkers, everybody, where we are loving God with all our minds. And today, as I mentioned, we have Dr. Elizabeth Jackson on the program. She is going to be having a discussion or giving a lecture on something that's extremely important to all of us as Christians. Now, before we do that, just please again confirm that you guys can hear both of us. And I see you can see us, but I just want to make sure. And we're going to keep going here. So
can you hear me also?
Yes.
Yeah.
Dr. Liz.
Someone said hi. So
all right. So we'll take it that they can. Yeah. All right, so I'll go, and what I have to say anyway isn't as important as what Dr. Jackson has to say.
So, that's not true.
So, okay, great. Thank you so much. I see they say we can hear you. All right. So really quickly, let me give you guys a super brief explanation of epistemology, because this lecture is part of a series we're going to be doing on the channel in or on epistemology, and more importantly, why it's important to apologetics or for apologetics. So if I defined epistemology as the branch of philosophy that deals with nature and sources of knowledge, as well as theories of knowledge, I think that would sort of summarize it pretty well. But you could even just say knowledge and be pretty close to hitting the target right on the mark. Now, to help expound on that a little more, let me give you some topics of epistemology. So some of the basic topics that are generally covered would be things like justification, truth, knowledge itself, and what it means to say we know something, perceptions and their reliability, how do we arrive at knowledge, certainty, can we have certainty, how do we deal with disagreement, what to do when we have counter evidence for a belief. And then in formal epistemology, you might deal with things like probability theorem, Bayes theorem, for those of you that are that follow along. And Dr. Jackson has actually written about that. She's done a brilliant paper. And so I'm not going to go into her whole, all of her work she's done on her CV, but please go to her website. It's if you're interested, it's Jackson.com, and she's got her CV on there, and you guys can see that. Now, one thing I want you to be aware of is why we need to understand epistemology, why we need to study it, all right, as Christians. And that is because when you see challenges like there is no evidence for God, common one, or you cannot be certain about your beliefs, Christians, look, we have good answers to these statements, these claims, and they can be easily answered with a basic understanding of epistemology. And that's why what Dr. Liz has to say today is so vitally important. Now, before I hand it over to her, two more things. Number one, the rules for the chat. I love having everybody here. We have no problem with dissenting opinion. In other words, if you disagree, that's totally fine. We want to hear from you, but no ad hominems, please. In other words, obviously no swearing. That's not really an ad hominem by itself, but it is when you aim it at somebody. No personal attacks. I don't want to see any of that. Okay, mods, feel free to delete comments that are like that. And if it continues, you can go ahead and block the person. We could, you be generous, and I'm trusting you and your discretion, however you as mods see that necessary. But we do want to hear from you guys. Questions, please put either a Q or question and then put who it's to, Dr. Jackson, or you can say Liz or Sean, that's fine. Erica, my wife who's in the chat, is going to be typing those up and sending them to me. If I don't address your question right away, I will try to get to it. It's just I don't want to necessarily interrupt Dr. Jackson if she's in the middle of a thought. So I'll let her finish her thought and then I'll interject. There is actually going to be a question and answer time at the end. So if you can save it till then, great. But if there's something that you need clarification on, by all means ask. One final thing. And Liz is going to talk about this in just a second, but I really want to break this down for you guys Crayola style. When Dr. Jackson gets into the 0.00 to 1 scale, all right, what she's talking about here in terms of this scale is, think of 1 as being a whole, right, or 100%. And so 0.9 is 90% of the whole. Don't get confused and think if something is a degree of 1, that means 1 out of 100. It's quite the opposite. That's the whole thing. And I'll let her elaborate on that. But I just want to give you guys a real simple understanding of that. For a long time, that it gets me when I see that or hear it, and I go, oh yeah, I know what they're saying. So just be aware of that. So with that, I'll hand it over to you. What's up, Doc?
All right, Sean, thank you so much. First, I just wanted to start by saying thanks for having me on the channel. I'm really excited to be here and to talk more about belief and credence and faith and certainty and all the topics you were just mentioning. So I'm pumped to be here. So Sean gave a really nice introduction, but also said I could say a little bit more about kind of my background. So I'm going to do that really quick and then kind of jump into some of the material. So right now, I am a research fellow at Australian National University. Basically what that means is I'm a postdoc. So I get paid to do research, which is really, really wonderful. I'm very lucky to have a job like this. So most of, well, actually, before I'll go into that, in the fall, I'm going to start as an assistant professor of philosophy at Ryerson University, which is in Toronto. So that's kind of where I'm at, where I'm going. In terms of my research, like Sean said, it's mostly in epistemology and in philosophy of religion. So those are the two main topics, and that's a lot of what I'm working on at ANU as well. So my dissertation is actually on the topic that we're going to talk about today, which is the relationship between belief and credence. And if you don't know what that is, that's totally fine, because we're going to get into that. But one way that I think you can summarize a lot of my research in epistemology is just by this question: what should we believe? You could also say, what credences should we have? But we'll get into that more. But what should we believe, I think, is a good way to sort of summarize the main question I'm interested in epistemology. And then in philosophy of religion, my research is in two main areas. So those two areas are faith, whether faith can be rational, or the relationship between faith and evidence. So we're going to talk about that a lot today too. And then also Pascal's wager. That's another area of research. And I actually think faith and Pascal's wager aren't totally disconnected, because they're both about this question: when is it rational to commit to God, or what makes a religious commitment rational? So that sort of unites, I think, my research and philosophy of religion. So yeah, that's a little bit about my research. I did my PhD in philosophy at Notre Dame I graduated in May 2019. So almost a year ago now, which is kind of crazy. So yeah, but that's a little bit of background. So what I'm going to do today is, first, I'm just going to give you a very basic introduction to belief and credence. What are they? What's the difference? What's going on with all of this? And like I said, this is the topic of my dissertation. And then I'm going to talk about two ways that belief and credence relate to questions in philosophy of religion. So the first thing I want to talk about is certainty, what belief and credence tell us about certainty. And then the second thing I'm going to talk about is what belief and credence tell us about faith, and how faith might in some way go beyond the evidence but still be rational. Like, what would that even mean? And I think belief and credence actually can shed quite a bit of light on that. So we're going to talk more about that. But first, let's just talk about what are belief and credence. These are words philosophers use. Belief is obviously a word that a lot of us probably use every day, but philosophers have models and views on what exactly belief is. So the way that philosophers tend to think about belief is basically saying this thing is true, or the world is this way. So if I believe it's raining outside, I believe it's true that it's raining outside, or the world is such that it's raining outside. And most philosophers who think about belief basically think for every truth, or they call it a proposition, it's basically like a sentence that can be true or false. So there's three attitudes you can take towards it. You can believe it, you can withhold on it, or you can disbelieve it. So I have a bunch of examples. If the forecast predicts rain, then I might believe that it will rain tomorrow. I also believe 1 + 1 = 2. But I withhold belief on certain things. That means I don't believe it's true, but I also don't believe it's false. So if you're about to flip a coin, I withhold belief that that coin will land heads. I also withhold belief that there's an even number of stars in the universe. On those, I'm undecided. It could go either way. It's kind of 50-50 in a sense. So that's withholding belief. And then there's also things that you disbelieve. So I disbelieve that 1 + 1 = 3. I disbelieve that the Cavs won the 2018 NBA Finals. I disbelieve that it will be sunny tomorrow if the forecast predicts rain again. So there's basically these three attitudes. So that's kind of one way we can think about belief. We can think about ways that we represent the world in our minds.
Doc, could I ask a quick question?
Yeah, absolutely.
On withhold belief, so just for the viewers that may not be familiar with it, that's not the same as disbelieving, correct?
Good. Yes. So those are different. So I withhold belief that if you're about to flip a coin, that it will land heads. I also withhold belief that it will land tails. I don't disbelieve it will land heads. It could land heads. And I don't disbelieve it will land tails. It could land tails. But I'm kind of undecided about which one is true. So, I mean, if we're, this is a lot of people here are probably interested in philosophy of religion. A lot of people think this is what distinguishes atheists from agnostics. So agnostics say, I'm undecided on whether God exists. I'm not saying God does exist, but I'm not saying God doesn't exist. I'm in the middle, Whereas atheists, well, and I guess there's a huge YouTube debate about the definition of an atheist, but the normal way that I think most philosophers would classify it is that they would say atheists believe God does not exist. So they kind of have a positive belief that says the world is such that there is no God. So that's different than being agnostic and saying, I'm not really making a claim either way. I'm kind of neutral or in the middle about the question of whether God exists. So does that help?
Yeah, thank you so much. And for those of you guys that want to read a great article on that atheism thing, see Paul Draper's SEP article on that, where he would even confirm as an atheist that it probably ought to be defined the way Dr. Jackson said that. So it's not just coming from a Christian. Atheists, Graham Oppie, others say the same. So that's great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Doc.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's belief. Okay, so we said we're going to talk about belief and credence. So here's the way I like to get people starting to think about credences. So I talked about two things I believe. I believe 1 + 1 = 2. I believe it's going to rain tomorrow. But notice that my attitude towards those two things isn't exactly the same, because I think it's more likely that 1 + 1 = 2 than that it will rain tomorrow. I'm more confident that 1 + 1 = 2 than that it will rain tomorrow. Because look, the forecast is wrong sometimes, especially in like the Midwest, the weather does crazy things. I think I have enough evidence to believe it will rain tomorrow, but that doesn't mean I'm 100% sure, right? Whereas I'm 100% sure, or at least pretty close to 100% sure that 1 + 1 = 2. So because I can believe two things, but be more confident in one than another, epistemologists like to appeal to this second attitude, and they call it credence. But if that, I mean, some people, it's a new word. You can think about it like a confidence level. It's basically like, how confident are you that something is true? And so like Sean said, one way you can model this confidence is on a scale from 1 to 0. So remember, with belief, we had belief, withholding, disbelief. In credence, when it comes to credences, we have this whole sliding scale where a credence of 1 means you're maximally 100% sure something's true. There's no chance it could be false. A credence of 0 means you're 100% sure something's false. There's no chance it could be true. And then there's all these different credences you could have in the middle. So I have a credence of 1 or very close to 1, that 1 + 1 = 2, but maybe there's a 90% chance of rain tomorrow. Then I have a credence of 0.9 that it will rain tomorrow. And when you say, okay, I'm going to flip this coin, I have a credence of 0.5. This coin will land heads. 1 + 1 = 3. My credence is very close to 0. You're throwing a 6-sided die. My credence that it will land a 6 would be 1/6, which I forget what that is in decimals, but math. So I think you get the point. Is that credences give you a lot more options than beliefs. There's actually technically an infinite number of options, because you could have like a credence of 0.632 or something. I mean, a lot of times our credences probably aren't that precise, but you have all these options anywhere between 1 and 0. And belief, you just have 3 options: believe, withholding, disbelief.
Could I ask a question on that as well?
Yeah.
So when it comes to credences, we can express those with modal terms as well, correct? In other words, we don't have to use um, the numbered degrees. It can be a little bit, not quite as fine grained, but a little bit broader. Does that make sense what I'm asking?
Yeah, so exactly. Yeah. So think about maybe your credence that your neighbor has a can of tuna. You're probably not going to say, oh, 0.23754. That's my credence. My neighbor has a can of tuna. It's probably going to be something like, oh, it's likely to be true because I know my neighbor likes tuna. Or, I'm not really sure. It could go either way. Maybe it's around 0.5, maybe not exactly 0.5. Or, so it might be, it's this thing that's called an imprecise credence, which we don't need to go into the details of that, but it might be this vague thing that you can't exactly put a number on, but it's likely to be true, it's unlikely to be true, it's moderately likely. So yeah, credences don't always have to be things you can put numbers on exactly. And the same way you could say, I said credences, we can think about them like confidence levels, right? So you can say, I'm pretty confident that this sports team will win. I was trying to think of a sports team, and then I was like, every single sport is like not happening right now because of the coronavirus. Very sad. RIP sports. But this team will win the Super Bowl or whatever. Go Chiefs, by the way. Yeah, this team, I could have a high credence without saying I have a credence of 0.93 that this team will win or something. So yeah, absolutely. That's definitely true.
Thank you. That's awesome.
Yeah. Oh, good.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that's awesome because for those of you that don't understand why I'm asking that, and just full disclosure, I'm not brilliant. I've been reading her dissertation and stuff, so I'm aware of what Dr. Liz is talking about here. But the reason why I think it's important for you guys to please get this, is that if you don't have training in probability theorem and in Bayesian, probability, it's okay. You don't need to be that precise. You can be more granular, if you will, about it. And that's critically important. So you want to take that and remember that, put that in the back of your head when she gets into some of these later things she's going to talk about, how important and foundational I think that is to this view. And that's why I want you guys to get this. So
yeah, great. Thanks for adding that. No, that's good. So I guess just as like if you're interested in my dissertation, I'll say really quick. So basically what my dissertation argued is that we have both beliefs and credences, and they both have sort of important roles to play in our mental lives. Sometimes we just believe stuff. We just treat it as true. It's fixed. It's this proposition that we believe. But other times we reason more probabilistically and we think, well, how likely is that to be true? And so I argued that like, here's some philosophical and psychological reasons to think this is the case. Are you eating your carrot? That's amazing. The view that I defended is called belief credence dualism, because dual, they're both there. And it's not to be confused with this other thing that's called mind-body dualism, which basically is the view that people have souls. That's also called dualism, but that's not the view I'm defending. It's, we could talk about whether it's related or not, but this view is just about whether we have both beliefs and credences or not. And so I argued, yes, we do. So that's a little summary of my dissertation. I always like to nerd out on it. So sorry if other people don't find it as fascinating as I do, but
it's awesome. And if you guys want any of her papers that she gives out, let me know, or I'll connect you with her or whatever. We'll get those to you. You guys really ought to read these. So
yeah, most of them are available. You can download on my website, but you can also email me too. And as just a general hack, you can email most academics and they'll send you their papers for free. You don't have to pay money for them. A lot of times the publishing agreements we sign don't allow us to upload them publicly, but we can email them to anyone that asks for them. So if you're interested in my papers, but anyone's papers in general, I would encourage you just to email the author, and likely they'll send it to you very quickly. So just a little side note there. So now I want to move on from this belief credence stuff. Hopefully the distinction is clear to everyone, and we're all kind of on the same page with that. And I want to talk about certainty, and I want to talk about whether certainty is actually that important. And actually what I want to kind of argue is that certainty is a little bit overrated, especially maybe in Christian circles. So I called this section the myth of certainty because I don't think it's as great as other people might think. So when we think about faith, and I think this could apply to all kinds of faith, but I'm thinking mostly about religious faith or faith in God, but this could also apply to like, faith in your wife or husband, or faith in your friends, or, those kinds of faith as well. So sometimes I think when we think about faith, we might think that faith is really similar to certainty. So, you're committed to it, it's true, and you couldn't be wrong about it. And if you have doubt, if you start to question, God or this person you have faith in, or whatever you're having faith in, you have weak faith, you lack faith, and maybe at a certain point you don't even have faith at all. And I think some people even go as far as saying that when you don't have certainty, that's like a sin, or it's morally wrong, or there's something, yeah, there's some kind of moral problem with you if you don't have certainty. So I totally disagree with all of this. I think this is the wrong way to think about faith, and I think certainty is not an ideal, at least in this strong sense. And I actually think when we think about beliefs and credences, that can shed light on why I think certainty is overrated in this way. Okay, so what I want to start off with is thinking about, well, what is certainty, and how can this belief credence thing help us see what certainty is? And basically what certainty is it's credence one. It's these things that are absolutely, certainly 100% true and could not be false. So maybe 1 + 1 = 2. That might be something you're certain of. Descartes famously said, "I think, therefore I am," and philosophers debate about, about that sentence. But some people think that that is something we can be certain of. That thinking sort of implies that you exist. So these mathematical truths, these logical truths in your own existence, those might be things we can be certain of. Some philosophers argue actually that those are even things that we can't be certain of, because like Descartes says, maybe an evil demon is deceiving us about math and logic. Maybe thinking doesn't mean you exist, it just means there's these random thoughts and beliefs and desires floating around, but there's no self. So we can even doubt these things. So, I mean, some philosophers think we can be certain of them, others don't. I'm not going to take a stand on it. But either way, the main point is there's actually very few things we can be 100% certain of. Even, that there's a table in front of me, or that there's a mic in front of me, or that I'm doing a YouTube stream, Well, this is, of course, a philosopher's thing to say, but you could be a brain in a vat. You could be in the matrix. You don't know that your perceptions are always reliable, and we're subject to seeing things that aren't there, to optical illusions. So we can't know for certain that even our senses are trustworthy. So the main point of all of this is we're certain in very, very few things. But note that does not mean that we can't believe a lot of things. I think it's still totally reasonable for me to believe that there's a table in front of me, and for me to believe that I'm looking at a computer, and to even believe it would rain tomorrow. Just because we can't have full and complete certainty doesn't mean that we still can't believe those things. So what this shows is that there's a lot of things that we believe, and even rationally believe, even though they're not at this credence of 1, they're not at this 100% point. And I think that's totally fine, and there's no problem with that. I mean, philosophers debate about this, and not everyone agrees with me, but I think that's just part of being fallible humans. There's lots of things we believe. There's lots of things that we rationally believe, even though we're not 100% certain. So this is just I haven't even talked about faith yet. I've just been talking about beliefs, and I've been saying, look, if you think we have to have certainty, you're probably going to have to give up a lot of your beliefs, if not all of them. Maybe you can have certain mathematical beliefs or something. Maybe you can believe you exist, but certainty is overrated, even when it just comes to beliefs themselves. So let's move to thinking a little bit more about faith. And what I want to argue here is that when it comes to faith, and when it comes to things that are important to us, I mean, one thing you might think is the most important things are the most certain, but that's just not true. And what I want to argue is that commitment is more important than certainty. So what do I mean by that? What this means is that there's certain beliefs that we structure our lives around. These beliefs represent things that are really important to us, things that are central and things that we build our lives around. These aren't necessarily the beliefs that we're certain of, but these are beliefs that sort of form the core of who we are and form the core of what our lives are about. So consider your belief that God exists. You might not be certain of that. You might worry about the problem of evil sometime. Like, why would God allow this coronavirus? That's a hard question. I mean, the problem of evil is tough. You might wonder, like, why does God seem hidden sometimes? Why isn't God more obvious, especially to people that seek and serve God faithfully? Doubt is a big issue, but it's way more important that this belief that God exists is central than that it's certain. It's a belief that for most Christians, you structure your life around it and you live in light of it, and it's really important to you. And you feel very strongly about it when it comes up or when someone challenges it. And if someone said, I'm going to give you some arguments that we need to rethink math, you'd probably be like, oh, okay, that's kind of interesting. But it wouldn't strike to the core of your being in the way that someone who is, arguing that God doesn't exist would strike to your core of your being. So that means the belief's more important, even if it's not certain to the same degree. So I think what this points to is that God doesn't want from us 100% certainty. Instead, God wants commitment. And so I think commitment to God is consistent with doubt, in even very serious doubt. So I've been talking for a long time, but I guess just to sort of sum up what I'm saying is that I think these commitments, these beliefs that are central in our lives, they represent a certain kind of faith in God, faith in your spouse, faith, you could even say, I have a commitment to finish grad school and to get my PhD. That could be a certain faith in yourself to keep going and to pursue this goal that you have. So I think faith is a lot more about commitment than it is about certainty. And on this view, faith is compatible with doubt. And I actually think not only is faith compatible with doubt, but doubt can actually be really healthy for us because it can force us to ask, why do we believe these things? And to look into those reasons for belief more, and to be kind of more intellectually honest with ourselves and to be more epistemically rational even. By epistemically rational, I mean, we have more evidence for our beliefs. We're not just believing them because that's what we were taught growing up or because that's what we want to be true, but we actually have a solid basis and we can defend our beliefs. So now I think Sean and I together are going to talk about a little bit of biblical support for this model. So maybe I'll talk about a couple verses and then Sean, if you want to jump in and add some stuff. So I guess I'll first of all say is that I do not have a PhD in biblical studies and I'm not a biblical scholar. But I do think that the Bible also supports this view. And I wanted to give a couple verses that I think support this. And then Sean's going to add more. He actually knows Greek and Hebrew and is really good at this stuff. So you should definitely take his word for it.
Thanks.
Yeah, of course. So I think one verse that's really interesting is in 1 Corinthians 13 that says, for now we only see as a reflection in a mirror, but then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know fully, even if I'm fully known. And so I think one way we can think about what this verse is saying is that right now there's something kind of not ideal about our knowledge. And I think one way you can interpret it is saying we just don't have certainty right now. But in heaven, maybe we will. There's interpretive issues about what exactly this is saying we'll have in heaven. But I think it's saying there is something non-ideal about our knowledge right now, and that's okay. Another passage that I really like a lot, my friend actually just got this tattooed on his arms, is from Mark 9. And this is the story about the father who brings his demon-possessed son to Jesus to be healed. And the father says to Jesus, help him if you can. So notice, he says, if you can. And what that's kind of indicating is, I don't have a credence of one that you can. There's this possibility, maybe I think it's likely that you can, but there's some possibility that you can't. So he's kind of expressing doubt in a way, and he's saying, I'm maybe not fully certain that you can. And then Jesus responds and says, everything's possible for him who believes. And the man says, I believe, help my unbelief. And I think that line especially is really great because it shows you don't have to be at 100%. If you have that belief, God can help you work through your doubt. And, in the story, Jesus heals the man's son. And so I think God blesses our faith when we step out in faith, even if we're not 100% certain. And the last thing I wanted to address before I'm going to turn it over to Sean is a verse in James. And this is a verse that you might push and you might try to say, well, this verse seems to make it sound like doubt's a sin. So I don't know about this, Liz. This is this is fishy. So here's what the verse says. And I'm going to read it in context because I actually think that's super important to understanding what it means. So it says, if any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Such a person is double-minded and unstable in all they do. Okay, so when thinking about this verse, I think this brings up just another really important lesson in epistemology that we all just need to be aware of. And that's, we have these concepts we've been talking about: faith, doubt, belief, credence. But by themselves, they don't tell us much. We have to say faith or doubt or belief in what? What's the object of that? What is the faith or the belief directed towards? And that's super important, just generally in philosophy, but also for our question here as well. So when I'm talking about faith and when I'm talking about doubt today, the main thing I'm focusing on is faith that God exists, or faith that Christianity is true, or doubt that God exists, or doubt that Christianity is true. And so note that this passage actually isn't talking about that. This passage is talking about faith that if you ask for it, God will give you wisdom. So it's not about someone struggling with the problem of evil, or someone struggling with, why would God be so hidden, or struggling, whatever doubts they're having about God's existence. It's someone saying, God's not going to give me wisdom when I ask for it. So that's actually a totally different question. So we can apply these concepts to lots of different categories, but in this case, this is actually not about the kind of faith and doubt that we're talking about today. Okay, Sean, that's all you.
Thanks, Doc. So notice I want you guys to notice something very critical here that Dr. Liz did. She quoted the verse in context. I used to teach biblical interpretation at the undergrad level, and I could tell you guys that is one of the most fundamental parts of biblical interpretation, and interpretation, period, it's an axiom, guys, that you need to look at these things in their proper context, historical, grammatical, and just surrounding in the paragraphs and the verses. One other verse, I think that I didn't have this in my notes, that you may be thinking, well, what about doubting Thomas, right? Okay, look, again, did Christ say, you wicked man, you have doubt? What? That's it. You're out of here. You're not going to the kingdom. No. He said, oh, you have doubt? Come here. Put your finger in my side. Go ahead. Put your hands in my. Now, obviously, yes, we can say that may be a bit hyperbolic, or maybe, Jesus is being a bit sarcastic, but he didn't get onto him. And then when Christ then says, look, you all are blessed because you have me, but those that don't, and I'm paraphrasing here, are going to be even more blessed because they don't have me present, and yet they're going to believe. He's not saying that you should believe without evidence. I had a friend who is I won't call him out, a Mormon. We were having a discussion about faith one day, and he said, well, you're trying to have certainty. And I said, no, I'm just trying to understand what you're saying and have a reasonable belief about it. And you haven't presented any evidence. You want me to believe, but based on what? You haven't given me anything. That's not what faith is, guys. Faith is not just random belief. Now, how do I know that? Well, let's look at a few verses here, and I think that'll help. Let me pull up my notes. So if we examine the usage, first of all, of the word faith throughout the Bible, we find that in the Old Testament employs various meanings. However, most revolve around this concept that can be summarized as fidelity or faithfulness to God. So there, that really doesn't carry the same thing that we're talking about when we say faith. But in the New Testament, okay, what most people are concerned with is the way it's being used there, because there we're talking about faith in Christ, or we're talking about faith in the way we're using it here today. And so of interest to us is Paul's usage and understanding of the word. Now, the root many of you may be familiar with is pistis, or just pist is going to be the core root there. And it's the root for almost every occurrence of the word faith in the New Testament. And it carries with it the sense of trust or confidence. Now, if you paid attention to what Doc said, she was talking about confidence all throughout that prior section. That's literally the usage. So when I was reading her work and I saw this, I'm like, you got to be kidding me. This is brilliant because it mirrors exactly what I know to be true. Of course, some of those are beliefs and some are credences, and the history and research that I've done throughout my life on these topics. And so what I see is the usage of this. And if those of you that want to know, like I actually have a paper that I did on fideism. If you want it, I'll give that to you. In the latter part of the paper, I list every occurrence of faith in the New Testament that's being used as trust. I give you a chart and a breakdown of how it's being used, the different usages and stuff, so that you can see that. All right. But just understand trust or confidence. But again, you have to have trust or confidence in something. To say, well, you just need to have faith, doesn't make any sense, because that's as if you're just saying you just need to have trust or confidence in nothing. There needs to be something on which to place that trust or confidence in. And we'll get back to that in a minute. Now, I'm going to anticipate an objection here, which I hear quite often, and that is a very misunderstood, very often misquoted passage of scripture, Hebrews 11:1. All right. And so I want to take a quick, short excursus on that. And I just can't justify ignoring this passage because it's so often misquoted or misunderstood. So let's look at it in its narrow context. And so I'm just going to quote verses 1-3. So starting in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 1-3, this is coming from the ESV. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And if you just read that, you'd already be in a heap of trouble and then try to apply that. Let me continue. For by it, the people of old received their commendation. By faith, we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. Now, this sort of lends a little bit more understanding, but once again, it's too narrow. If we stop at the conviction of things not seen, then we have very successfully cherry-picked the passage, guys. One needs only to understand the broader context from chapter 10 and a few verses following chapter 11, verse 1, to understand what this passage is actually saying. So just to summarize, I would recommend all of you read this later on, or you can read along with me now, chapter 10, and start around verse 32. Now here the writer of Hebrew reminds the reader of the suffering they endured. Now, not us, the reader, I mean the reader, the direct recipient of the letter. That's something you need to pay attention to when you're doing biblical interpretation also, is who wrote it, why did they write it, who are they talking to? So the writer is reminding the reader of the suffering they endured after their conversion, and to remember, as they did then, they had a better possession. Verse 34, so they should not throw away their confidence. They need to have endurance. Verse 35 and 36, they need to remember what is promised. The writer puts the nail in the coffin right here, as this is what their faith or trust is in. In other words, it's not just the way this verse is typically over in chapter 11, verse 1 is, oh, faith is just the evidence of things unseen. So you don't need evidence. You don't need to have faith in anything. Just have faith, as if it's just arbitrary and random. But again, that's misapplying the passage. So what we see here is in chapter 10, verse 39, we are not, just going to summarize this, but of those who have faith and preserve their souls. So when the passage flows into the statement that faith or trust is the confidence or assurance in what they hope for, we now understand what it was they were hoping for, guys. See, that's critical. You need to understand what this thing is that he's talking about. So in chapter 11, something else to note, if you continue reading then on after that verse, where all the examples of faith or trust are all these examples that are given of Enoch or Abraham or whoever it is that are mentioned, notice that every single one of them have some sort of direct experience of God or some conversation with him or the angel of the Lord or whoever it is. So they have faith in something based on some sort of, if we could say, evidence loosely there. So conclusion, faith is belief with evidence, and we don't want to misapply this verse. We don't want to take it out of its context. Yeah, I think that's all I have, Doc, unless I missed anything in my notes there. So I hand it back over to you.
All right, great. No, I think that's super helpful, especially because that Hebrews passage is one of the main ones on faith. But I like how someone trained in biblical studies can give us an analysis of it. So I think that's great. I also thought the point about Thomas is really good. It's like Thomas is doubting and Jesus doesn't say, oh, you just need to have more faith. Like, what are you doing? Jesus
Right.
gives him evidence, he's like,
Yep.
here's some evidence to show you that this is real, that I'm not a ghost, or, you can
Yeah.
feel my hands, literally. So I think that's really crucial. And I think it's really sad in the church when someone's struggling with doubt or someone has questions about Christianity, and then people say, you just need to have more faith. You need to stop asking questions. I mean, what
Right.
are they saying? Like, you should just stick your head in the sand and not think? Like, that's ridiculous. So I think that's absolutely the wrong way to think about faith and the wrong way to respond to someone when they have questions. And yeah, I think faith is based on good evidence, especially rational faith. So we shouldn't think about it like, here's faith over here and here's evidence over here. That's not the right way to think about it at all. So
Yeah. And one final point on that is the whole Gospel of John, which is where I'm drawing that passage on from Thomas on. If you look at John's ending of his gospel there, what does he say? He says, I wrote these things that you may believe. Well, in other words, he's saying, I'm giving you this evidence. So you have something so you have evidence on which to base your beliefs on, right? So, or credence, however you're looking at your confidence level. And so that's really important. So,
yeah, great. So I hope now you're convinced that certainty is not this thing we should all be striving for. It's not this ideal state, but what's important is commitment and the centrality of a belief rather than the certainty of a belief. So that's just a quick kind of summary of what we've talked about. I think this last point about faith and evidence transitions really nicely into just the last thing I wanted to talk about today, which is how beliefs and credences can help us understand ways that faith might be rational, but still in some way go beyond the evidence. Because again, I'm not trying to say there's faith over here and there's evidence over here, and if you have questions, you just need to have better faith. That's not what I'm saying. But I still think it's interesting to think about ways that faith might go beyond the evidence, because that's kind of a stereotypical thing a lot of people say, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's irrational either. So what I want to show you is how belief and credence can kind of help us see this. Okay, so here's the general picture that I want to give. So remember, we could have a belief, like a belief that it will rain tomorrow, and then a credence that it will rain tomorrow, like a 0.9 credence it will rain tomorrow, and a belief that it will rain tomorrow. And sometimes when we get evidence, the evidence can move our credences up or down, but not change the fact that we believe that thing. So let's say right now, I check the forecast, see 90% chance of rain. I believe there's a 90% chance, I believe it will rain tomorrow. And I have a credence, 0.9 credence that it will rain tomorrow. And then I look at my phone and I see, oh, now there's only an 80% chance of rain. I'll still believe it's going to rain tomorrow, but my credence is going to go down a little bit from 0.9 to 0.8. So there's cases where our belief stays sturdy, our belief doesn't change, but our credence moves up or down this sliding scale. So what I wanted to do is sort of give some interesting examples of this and then talk about ways that this might be applied to faith. Okay, so here's one interesting case. I'm going to skip the first case and just go to the second one because it's already 2:45. So here's one interesting case that I think is really a cool thing that's kind of been really popular in the epistemology literature lately. So let's suppose you leave your cell phone on the table and you go to the bathroom and you come back and someone stole your cell phone. And there were only two people in the room when you left, Jake and Barbara. So you're trying to figure out who stole your cell phone, and you actually don't know Jake or Barbara very well. You don't know which one of them is more likely to be a thief. But let's just say, and this is totally made up statistic, but let's say men are 10 times more likely to steal cell phones than women. That's not true, but Sean's like, well, maybe.
maybe.
But let's just say men are 10 times more likely to steal cell phones than women. In this case, so you're withholding belief about who stole your cell phone because you don't know if it's Jake or if it's Barbara. But some epistemologists argue your credence that Jake stole it should be close to 0.9 because men are 10 times more likely to steal cell phones than women. So this is a really interesting case because you're withholding belief. We talked about belief, withholding, disbelief. You're in this middle one, you're withholding, but your credence is actually kind of high. And people debate about whether that's the right response to these cases, but I think it's actually kind of intuitive that you should be as confident as the statistic tells you. But because it's just a statistic, it doesn't give you reason to think that Jake in particular is guilty. It just gives you reason to think that a man is more likely to do it. So you shouldn't believe he did it, but you should have a high credence that he did it. So this is interesting because this is a case where the evidence doesn't change what we believe. You're still withholding belief, but the evidence moves your credence up. So that's kind of weird. Okay, here's a second case, and I think this kind of case is even more interesting for questions about faith. So let's say you have a brother who you trust and love very much, and you know about his character, and he's not the kind of person that would commit a serious crime, but he actually becomes suspect for a murder. So let's say at first, before he becomes suspect for a murder, you believe and you have a very maybe 0.99 credence that your brother would never commit a murder. Your brother becomes a suspect for this murder, and the evidence starts mounting against him. So there's more and more evidence. Maybe they find his fingerprints at the crime scene. Maybe, there is some really serious evidence. It's not perfect evidence. It's not, they haven't proved he did it, but there is some evidence he did it. At the same time, he's your brother. You've known him your whole life. You know he would never murder someone, right? So what people say you should do in this case is you should continue to believe your brother did not commit this crime, but your credence maybe shouldn't stay at 0.99. Maybe it should go down to 0.8 or 0.7 or even like 0.6. So your credence should move down, but you can continue to believe. You can continue to commit to this. You're saying, look, my brother is not the murderer. He did not commit this crime. But your credence is still tracking the fact that there is this evidence that's mounting against him. And maybe if they did find evidence that was just completely conclusive, maybe at a certain point you should give up the belief. But as long as the evidence isn't conclusive, especially given your history with your brother, I think you can still rationally continue to believe that your brother's innocent. So what I want to suggest is that the fact that belief can kind of remain steady, even though confidence levels are moving up and down, can actually tell us a lot about what it could mean for faith to be rational, but in some sense go beyond the evidence. So I think there are actually cases where evidence moves our credences up, but doesn't give us faith. Those are the less interesting cases. But the more interesting cases are cases where we have faith in something and evidence moves our credences down, but we can continue to rationally maintain that faith. So I'm going to give you an example of each case. Okay, so here's a case where I think you shouldn't have faith in something, even if you get some evidence that it's true. So let's say someone does a study and they find out that Notre Dame graduates are very likely to keep secrets. So if you graduate from Notre Dame, you're really good at keeping secrets, right? Someone meets me, they don't know me at all, but they find out I graduated from Notre Dame. Okay, so the thought is they should raise their confidence that I'll keep a secret. They should, maybe if 90% of Notre Dame graduates keep secrets, maybe they should have a 0.9 confidence that I'll keep the secret. But they don't know me. They don't really have evidence that I, in particular, would be a good secret keeper. And so I would argue that they should withhold belief that I'll keep their secret. And maybe they shouldn't tell me their secret just based on the statistical evidence. They should wait to get to know me first and then see if I'm a trustworthy person. So this would be a case where your credence or your confidence moves up, but you don't have that belief. Okay, that's the more boring case. Here's the more interesting case, because I think this case is one that shows us how faith could be rational, but be steadfast in light of counter evidence. So I'll give you a non-religious case first and then a religious case. So here's the non-religious case. Billy is happily engaged and will be married soon. So he believes him and his spouse are going to be faithful to each other. They're not going to get divorced. So he has this belief and he has this high credence. They're not going to get divorced. They're both faithful people. They don't have the history of divorce, whatever. He has evidence for it. Then he finds out half of all marriages end in divorce. That's a startling statistic, right? So because of that statistic, he becomes less confident that him and his spouse will get divorced. But he still knows about their character. he knows they're people that, like I said, don't have a history of divorce in their family. He still has this evidence. And that evidence allows him to maintain his belief, even though he should be less confident that him and his spouse will get divorced. So I think that's a way of demonstrating faith in his spouse and even himself. They won't get divorced, even though he's less confident. Okay, here's a case, a religious case. So let's say Sarah has faith that Jesus rose from the dead. She has faith that this miraculous event occurred. She has a high credence, or she believes it, and she has a high credence in it. And then she learns about this thing. Some of you might know it, some of you might not, but it's called Hume's argument against miracles. And basically Hume tries to argue that sort of given regular laws of nature that we observe, a miracle's occurring is very unlikely, and we should never trust someone's testimony that a miracle occurred because of these kind of regular laws of nature. That's a really basic rough summary of it, but the details of the argument aren't super important for our purposes. But it's basically an argument that miracles are unlikely. So this counter evidence might cause Sarah's credence to go down a little bit. She says, well, yeah, I mean, I do think the laws of nature are important, whatever. Maybe I'm a little bit less confident that Jesus rose from the dead. But as long as she has a solid basis for her belief and her faith that this miracle occurred, that's no reason for her to give up her belief. So she can continue to believe that Jesus rose from the dead, even though her credence gets lower. I have another example too, and it's just basically based on the problem of evil, but the same thing, like someone who believes God's a good God, God's a loving God. In philosophy, we call this omnibenevolent. But that person experiences evil in the world. Again, the coronavirus. I mean, what is it? Locusts in Africa right now. There's been some terrible stuff going on in Africa, but no one's paying attention to because of the coronavirus, but lots of crazy bad stuff happening in our world. So this person has this, solid argument that God's good, but they keep observing these evils in the world. And I would argue that because of those evils, it could cause their credence to go down, but as long as they have a solid basis for that belief, they don't have to give up that belief that God's good. So here's the general thing I'm pushing, and I'm going to be done in about 30 seconds. The idea is that there's certain kinds of evidence that can move our credences up and move our credences down. But that evidence doesn't need to change what we believe or what we have faith in. So our belief and our faith can be steadfast, even as our kind of credences, our confidence levels, and our evidence move up and move down. But we still have this steadfast faith to kind of rely on, even through times when, we think the probability that God exists is a little bit low, and then times when we think it's really high. But that's tracking something, but this belief gives us this stability and this faith that enables us to be steadfast in line of counter evidence. So what I want to argue is that this is a way that faith could go beyond the evidence, but nonetheless be perfectly epistemically rational. So yeah, that's basically all I have today, but I'm happy to take questions from Sean, from people in the chat. So yeah.
We got a couple good ones that I saw so far, and Erica's sending me some, I think, and I forgot I have to have the live stream thing open. So I do have some of the questions there. Real quick, just so you guys, I want you to really, really, really get what Doc just laid out for you there. In other words, just because some random evidence comes in, and there's a number of ways you need to deal with that evidence anyway. You can see our video on, how to examine evidence and whatnot. Make sure to obviously check that it's obviously reliable and all those other things that go along with that. But in other words, even if that lowers your credence, you can still have faith and be totally rational. That's critically important, so that just because somebody comes in and goes, well, the likelihood that God actually exists is highly low. Well, first of all, I can look at how did they arrive at that, right? What's their justification? Yeah. Also epistemology. But then secondly, just know that in the meantime, you're still totally rational and saying, well, I'm still going to hold this belief. And I'm really summarizing there. So if I butcher anything, Doc, feel free to correct me on that.
No, that's great. Yeah, that's good.
And so I will, let me flip over some questions. I had a random thought, but I forgot it, but that's okay. It's not all that important.
If it comes back to you, we can.
There we go. Yeah, I may blurt it out. God is Good had a question, and I responded to him, but I wanted to give you an opportunity too, because it was a good question, and I liked the way these folks, they got their thinking caps on, no pun intended. We actually have some merchandise coming out. That's going to be one as a thinking cap.
Ooh,
So
I like it.
we'll send you one for nothing. All righty.
Aw.
So here, the question God is Good 777 has is Dr. McGrew, Timothy McGrew, offered that faith is trusting, holding to, and acting on what one has good reasons to believe is true in the face of difficulties. Is this a good definition?
Yeah, that's great. Yes, I like that definition a lot. So one thing I do think is interesting about this definition is that it sort of gets at the two ways you can have faith, or the two kinds of faith that I didn't get to talk about earlier, but I think I'll use this as an opportunity to kind of talk about it. So one way you can have faith is kind of like a mental state. It's like a belief or like a credence. It's this thing in your head. And that thing in your head will lead to other things, but faith is primarily something that's going on up here between your ears, right? So that's one way of having faith. Another way of having faith is by action, acting in faithful ways. And commitments often are things that result in actions and not just kind of a thing in your head, right? So I like that McGrew's definition had both trusting, which I think is primarily a cognitive thing, a thing in your head, but also action, and those two, I think, are different kinds of faith. And that's important because what makes a belief or a credence or something in your head rational is actually different than what makes an action rational. But at the same time, they're both crucial aspects of faith too. And when you look at the Bible, for example, it talks about both. It says, like, even demons believe and shudder. You have to act as well. So it's interesting because we can think about their rationality differently, but also they're very related. And both very, very important. So yeah, I like that definition a lot.
Yeah, and I think I remember part of what I wanted to mention to you all, and please feel free to push back on this, Doctor, if you don't agree with it. I'm amendable to this position, but it seems to me that you have, in the same way you have that dichotomy in faith, you also have this faith in and faith that. In other words, I have faith in God and faith that God are two different propositions. Faith that God exists is different than saying I have faith in God. And I'll try to make a simple distinction here. If I use an illustration, I have faith that Abraham Lincoln was a president of the United States. Okay. Versus if I say I have faith in Abraham Lincoln, I'm talking about having faith in something about him, in this case, his character. So when I have faith in God, I'm saying I have faith in his character. If I have faith that he exists, now I'm talking about his ontology. So it's a little bit different there. In the same way, we could use that about a chair. I have faith that the chair exists. I have faith in the chair that it will hold me up when I sit in it. And so sometimes we want to distinguish between the two. Not that Doc's not doing that, but just so you guys think about making these distinctions. We want to get you to, to do that.
Yeah, no, that's great. I do think, so I think that's a really important distinction, and I didn't bring it up earlier, partially just because I was trying to keep it on the simpler side, but I do think it's really important because when you say I have faith that something, it's exactly what you said. The object of that is going to be something that's true or false, like a sentence or what philosophers might call a proposition. So you can say, is that true? Is that false? I have faith that God exists. That could be true or false. I have faith that this chair will hold me up. That could be true or false. When you have faith in, often that thing isn't true or false, right? If I have faith that God exists, well, God's not true or false. God's like a person or a thing or a being or whatever.
Right.
Or, I have faith in the Constitution. Well, the Constitution might have sentences in it that are true or false, but it in and of itself isn't true or false. Or I have faith in recycling, right? So this true falsity element, it makes faith that much more similar to belief than faith in. So it's interesting because you might think, it gets complicated, but faith that might be more like the head faith I was talking about. And then faith in could be more connected to action, potentially. Yeah. I'm not 100% sure that that's the right way to think about it, but that's one way to think about it. So.
Yeah, and I realize we're sort of spitballing you guys, so some of these may not. And when you're trying to oversimplify too, then you lose some things there. We're trying to be careful. Yeah. And I almost wonder if we could say the faith in could almost be credenced or degreed. It's not in the sense, I know where you're going with that, and I can see pushback on that immediately. I'm just trying to paint a dichotomy there so they could. So, does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting question because what I was kind of pushing before is like there's some sense in which faith is stable even when your credences,
Mm,
go up and down. But I think that doesn't mean that faith couldn't also in some way come in degrees. I mean, I think this
mm,
is sort of puzzling, and I haven't honestly fully thought through it all myself, but I do think you could have more or less faith, and that could also be a function of not just how what you believe, but how much you're willing to act on it too.
mm. I
So
like
I
that.
do think you could maybe have faith that something is true, but because the stakes are just so high, you maybe won't act on it. That's possible. So then you would just have a lesser degree of faith. But yeah, I think that's a really interesting and potentially underexplored issue is what do we do with this idea that faith seems to come in degrees? So
Aw-
that's a good question.
Awesome. So we have one here from Joel Samuelson. Joel, you have two. I'm going to ask your first question that you asked earlier. I caught that at the end, but because I some of these are a teeny bit more on the point. I think it was a good question. I just want to get to the ones that are absolutely about what Doc's saying in case she has to go at some point. So his first question is, what are some things helping you in times of doubt? Some arguments besides Pascal or something of God's action in your life?
Sorry, I'm laughing because he said besides Pascal, almost as if he was, uh,
He's probably
knowing
familiar
that
with your
I,
work.
I would, well, or like that's kind of a go-to thing for me because that actually does help me a lot to think
Yeah.
about, look, even if I'm not 100% sure, I have a lot to gain if this is true and little to lose if it's false. So I know that's not the answer you're looking for, but just in terms of just personally, that actually helps me a lot to say, look, I'm going through serious doubt, but I have a lot to gain if it's true and not a lot to lose if it's false. And I'm just going to continue on that path. And I actually don't think that that's dishonest at all. I think that's actually something that God would really look favorably on is like continuing to seek God even in the midst of having really serious questions. And I guess one thing I'll say here too that I didn't really get to get into just because I only had a limited amount of time, but I think in the church today it's really easy for people to emphasize the importance of belief and evidence, and that's important. I mean, that's what we've been talking about all day. But another thing that's interesting that I think actually makes faith different than belief is that faith requires desire. So if I say, I have faith that you're going to win a marathon that you're about to run, Sean, but I hope you lose. Well, that doesn't even really make sense, right? Like,
Right.
requires me to desire the thing that I have faith in. And
Mm,
so, and belief doesn't. I believe all these awful things all the time about the world. Like there's wars going on and locusts and coronavirus and whatever. You can believe whatever without having any accompanying desire. But most people think when you have faith that something's true, you have to have that desire element. And I think that's actually really important because it means that faith isn't just about what's the exact level of evidence you have for a proposition, but especially when we're talking about action oriented faith, it's also about your desires and it's about how much how much you want to know God and how much you think the Christian story is beautiful and would be really great if true. So I think that's a really interesting element that makes faith different than belief is faith kind of has this desire component that belief doesn't have. um Sorry, I think, what was the question again?
it was
I'm
about
like,
Pascal. No, you're on it. You're on it. The
yeah,
question was,
okay.
yeah, in terms of what some things that help you besides Pascal's wager. I wanted to add something when you're
Hmm,
done, but you may already say it before I
yeah.
do. So
No, so yeah, I guess Pascal, I said, does help me, but you weren't interested in that. But then also thinking about just the importance of desire and how desire plays a big role, and that's often something that people in the church aren't talking about as much. I think they're more just talking about whether you believe it or not. But desire is actually, I mean, a lot of people think, well, what makes an action rational? Belief and desire. You need both of those things. If I believe there's food in the fridge but don't want food, then I'm not going to go get it. In the same way, if I want food but don't believe there's food in the fridge, I'm also not going to go to the fridge. You need both the belief and the desire. So yeah,
mm,
I think cultivating my desire for God, even when I have doubt, is also something that's really helped me personally. So I don't know if you want to add anything, but
you
yeah.
actually alluded to it right there, and I was going to appeal
Okay.
to Pascal as well. Something else he said, which is for somebody who has, and I don't remember. You can correct me because you're an expert in this with Pascal, at least more than I am. But he said, for somebody who's having doubt or that has disbelief, go expose yourself I think his example was go to church or go around Christians, if I remember correctly. But I would say here is look at positive evidence first. Do it and do proper analysis. Don't rush. There's no rush. Like I told you guys in another video, you can always suspend judgment if you need to have a belief, but don't need to, as we've seen here. You can have a degree here. And so just remember that. Expose yourself to positive things, and obviously be fair. I'm not asking you guys to do what's called the neglect of negative inferences, or evidence. So don't neglect negative things. But what I'm saying is, if you're having trouble, go back and expose yourself. I've noticed I've had fellow Christians write into me and say, I'm struggling with my faith. I'll say, well, what's going on? And they tell me, well, I'm only watching and reading all of these atheists. And I go, well, that's probably part of the issue. But the other part of that is, are you carefully examining what they're saying? And a lot of times, well, no, I don't know how to do that. Okay, again, fair enough. But make sure, if you're going to expose yourself to all that, A, you know how to examine that evidence, and B, make sure to also expose yourself to the other side of it, because we want to be methodologically neutral, and that's the key. So
can I add something too?
Please.
I think that just something that people might not always realize, especially maybe people immersed in the YouTube world, and this is something that Cam from Capturing Christianity talks about a lot too, is that Christian philosophy is flourishing right now. There's tons of Christians that are coming up with all these really interesting arguments about whether God exists and faith and all this stuff. It's exploding. I mean, part of it's because of planting its influence and various things, but it's amazing how many Christian philosophers I know, and how there are certain people on YouTube that will bring up these arguments and just be like, this argument is clearly debunked, or like, no one has an answer to the problem of evil. This is just totally decisive. And that's just not true. But people, right. It's hard. And that's one reason I love doing these interviews, is because a lot of this Christian philosophy is in these hard to understand peer-reviewed journals that people often don't have access to and might have trouble understanding too. And that's why I think it's really important to get philosophers on the ground talking about their views and ideas in a way that is more accessible to kind of popular audiences. But I want you to know, like, if some atheist comes up to you and says, I've debunked this argument, or, I've given all these new objections to this thing, they probably haven't. And it's probably something that Christian philosophers have been talking about and thinking about a lot. And Sean's channel and Cam's channel are both great ways that philosophers are hopefully getting exposure to wider audiences. But I do want you to know that Christian philosophy is exploding right now, and there are a lot of answers out there, and hopefully those are becoming more accessible as well.
Yeah, and read the professional atheist philosophers. What you're going to see is they're not making those wild over the top claims, and if those guys aren't saying these things are refuted, or which is a term I hear being misused all too often. And some random guy with no philosophical training has managed to stumble on all these things that no one else has thought of. Is it possible? Yes, but my credence in that, all right, is very low. And moreover, I have another question for you in a second. I'll get off my soapbox. But moreover is that it's very unlikely, if I made an inductive argument, that would be a very weak inductive premise for the likelihood that person with no training and with all of the philosophers out there working on these problems have discovered it. I just can't see that. I would have to look at the evidence again. So always do that first. So, man, well said, Doc. So another question was, this is kind of I like the question, and I say funny, not in the sense, I'm not making fun of it. I like the way this person's thinking. So what does Dr. Liz think Moses, so the patriarch, level of credence was while he was on Mount Sinai? I'm assuming they mean while he's face to face with God, or while he's having these conversations, or the level of credence the apostles had after the resurrection, or Jesus, the man's level of credence. Now that one, I'm not sure what they mean by, or Jesus, the man's level of credence, as if it's a totally separate mind. That might need some unpacking in terms, guys, of if you assume, I assume Jesus is both fully God and fully man, but I'm not entirely certain that his man mind had a separate belief doxastic structure or noetic structure from his God mind there. So that one we might have to save. That's pretty philosophically deep. But Moses' credence and the apostles' credence.
Yeah, that's actually a really, really great question. And it's really interesting to think about. So I would say, actually, they believe the things, right? Um, but in the same way that I can kind of give a really basic, look, you could be a brain in a vat, you could, you know, someone could be deceiving you about your senses, whatever. I can just give this really basic, thought experiment, and then you're automatically realizing you don't have credence one that there's a table in front of you. It's really high, but it's not one. I would actually argue that even in these cases, these people didn't have credences of one or 100% certainty. Um, and that might be controversial, but I think what's important to note is this. When reasoning, belief and credence are kind of like two different tools. Like if you have a toolbox and you have a hammer and a nail in it, you can think about belief and credence kind of like your two tools in your toolbox, two of them at least. Maybe faith is another tool, and when reasoning, we can reason using our belief or reason using our credence. And I have another chapter in my dissertation where I talk a lot about, reasons we might reason using one or reason using the other. But what these people might have been doing is they might have been really relying on their belief tool, their, belief that God is here or God is revealing himself or whatever, and not as much relying on their credence tool, at least in this case. And because they're doing that, it gives them kind of the boldness to act in the ways that they did. But I think the other thing that's also really important to note too is these people had these, like, they knew God in these amazing ways that I think gave them really strong desires for God, and they could really see like how good the outcome could be if they followed God. And I think that's also another really important part of sort of Christian commitment and Christian boldness, is having that desire as well. So I would argue that they didn't have credences of one, but they believed it and they had strong desires. And those two things sort of underlied, I mean, like the Hebrews passage you read showed, like, talked about them as Christian heroes. And I think in that, we can have the exact same mental states and the same kind of boldness. So that's definitely controversial. I'm giving my own opinion. Not everyone might agree with me, but that's sort of my view.
Yeah, and just to defend so that you guys understand, because I want you guys to think like philosophers, atheists, Christians, I don't care, agnostic, doesn't matter. I want you guys to think rationally and clearly about things. Think deeply, okay? Don't just jump to conclusions. What Dr. Liz isn't saying is that they didn't have confidence or, oh, well, they just didn't believe or whatever. If we had asked those patriarchs in a very folk sort of philosophical or psychological way, they might say, oh, I had a credence of one, not understanding what she's talking about. But she's actually trying to be very clear and honest about the way these things, these degrees work. When you're talking about having a credence of one, guys, I mean, that's absolutely, if I understand Doc correctly, that's absolutely
Exactly.
certain. And as she introduced, you can't have that kind of certainty about very many things. So you can and we don't need to, guys. That's the other thing, where you may hold, where you may say, oh, I'm confident or I'm certain, on her scale might be 90%. So, or 0.9. Okay. If you understand the way she's measuring that, or a little bit higher, it could be 0.99, but to be but to be one is incredibly high. So it's a matter of, to some extent, we're talking in different ways and expressing it. She's being very honest and direct and clear about it. And I hope I represented you fairly. If that needs correction, please.
No, that's perfect. That actually, I think, helps a lot. Because yeah, they might say, yeah, I'm 100% confident in this thing, but really, that, I think what they mean something different than by what we mean. I think maybe they mean, I believe it and I'm very confident, but not 100% in the sense that we're talking about. So that's a really good clarification.
Yeah, so I just don't want her to be straw man later on. And if they do, anyone does that, you're going to get it from me. So not you guys, our viewers are awesome. But a couple, are you okay on time, Doc?
Yeah.
Okay.
No rush.
Couple more questions. So for Dr. Liz, man, no one wants to ask me any questions. That's a good thing. So what are your thoughts on navigating discussions with people who define faith in more of a blind faith kind of way? It's a great question. How would you engage that discussion?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think one thing that at least a lot of philosophers think, and I haven't interacted with as many people that are just like, I just define faith this way. So I'm not sure exactly how effective this would be. But one thing a lot of philosophers point out is that religious faith isn't the only kind of faith. Faith is something that we talk about and appeal to all the time. In personal relationships, it's everywhere. But even in just like, should we run to the store? Is it open? Well, I have faith that it's open. I mean, that's a trivial example, but you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
I think it's something we appeal to all the time. It's not just a religious thing. So I think if you just insist on defining faith as blind faith, I would wonder, well, like, what about the faith that you would have like in your spouse or in your friend or in your siblings? What is that, just a different kind of thing? Is that not actually faith? And I think a lot of philosophers think that whatever makes that kind of thing rational can similarly actually make faith in God rational too. They're on a par or something. There's some kind of parity between those two kinds of faith. And another thing you can say too, which is something that if people just insist on defining something a certain way, you can just say, okay, you can have the word faith. I don't want to argue about words, but if you're just defining it as something that's irrational, then that's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in this other thing, which is, an interesting combination of maybe belief and desire, and maybe in some sense goes beyond the evidence, although I don't know if you'll want to say that when you're talking to these people, because I think they'll automatically probably jump on you for saying that. But it underlies a lot of our really important commitments to ourselves and commitments to others. So if these people want to take the word faith and just define it as irrational, then say, take that word, that's fine. I'm interested in a different thing, and we don't have to make this a debate about words. So yeah, those are the two things I would say. One is just pointing out there's lots of secular and interpersonal instances of faith that aren't religious at all, that I think almost everyone appeals to. And then two, if they want to make it a battle about words, they can.
Yeah. And I think if I supplement faith with trust, which is what now when I read the Bible after all my studies, I always just go trust, belief. Okay, I know it's just a habit of mine. But even the word trust in our modern language, that seems to me, and correct me here, Doc, that we are still saying when we trust something that there is a degree where that goes beyond. If we can't have absolute certainty, guys, what we're saying, I think, what I'm hearing, is that that's going to have to go beyond what you have, if that makes sense. Unless you're just going to search exhaustively. In other words, I have faith that I'm going to make it to my destination when I get in my car. But guys, I was in a horrible accident back last September, but I didn't examine the roads. I didn't do all these things to be sure that I wasn't going to be in the accident. Prior to that, I had a reasonable degree based on all kinds of information, but I didn't have certainty. So am I on the right track there, Doc, with what you're saying?
Yeah, that's another great way of thinking about it, is that faith is similar to trust. And what do you do? Like, never trust anyone? I mean, if you never trusted anyone, you would have almost no beliefs. Like, you have all these beliefs about where certain countries are and what they look like, but those are just based on trust of testimony of other people that have been there. If you've never been to Russia, you've never seen it for yourself,
Right.
So one thing that's interesting is that so many of our beliefs are based on the testimony of other people, and we're forced to trust other people or have almost no beliefs. So if you want to have almost no beliefs, I mean, you go ahead, but those beliefs are really useful for navigating the world, and it'd be really hard to get on without them. So
yeah, notice what she said there, guys. The people who poo-poo testimony, because Christians, one of our biggest pieces of evidence for our religious beliefs and credences is the Bible, which is testimony, all of it, right? And so if people they tend to want to attack testimony, but even scientists, everybody, we rely on it heavily. Academics, why? Academic papers. Oh my goodness, it's testimony. I'm trusting somebody else's. I'm not going back necessarily and spot checking their work or performing the same tests or any of that. I'm taking their testimony on it. So that's a great point. So another one, Brando, I think, is the questioner here. Thinkers, is it fair to put more importance on Pascal's wager when we also gain from following God in this life, as well as what happens after we die? Does that question make sense?
I think I know what he's getting at.
Okay.
So I think what he's pointing out is this. One way you could think about Pascal's wager is it's just really focused on heaven and hell. It's really focused on the afterlife.
I got it. Okay.
And one way you can make the argument is say, just forget about this life altogether and just focus on, these afterlife possibilities and maybe maximizing your chance of going to heaven or whatever. But I think he brings out a good point, which is that you can actually have a version of the wager that doesn't ignore considerations in this life, but actually emphasizes those as very important. And I think Mike Roda's version in his book, Taking Pascal's Wager, at least talks about this a little bit. But the idea is that there's a bunch of really interesting sociological studies that show that religious people are happier and healthier and more content and less likely to get divorced and all these different things. And of course, you can question those and you can debate about those, but this evidence is mounting and very interesting. And so then the idea would be like, look, you can look at both this life and the afterlife. And in both cases, it's better to believe in God or to practice a religion. And in decision theory, what that principle is called, it's called dominance. And basically it means that in every state of the world, it's better to, in this case, it would be practice a religion, right? So in this life and the next life, it's better. So then we actually don't even have to rely on these complicated debates about probabilities and infinities, because it's just better no matter what if you practice a religion. So I think that's actually another really interesting version of Pascal's wager. It takes that step though of getting all those arguments that show that religious people are happier and healthier. And I just haven't, gone into that fully in my work, but I think that's a really interesting and promising argument. So
That's awesome. So, okay, I got one here for me. This is an easy peasy one. So I'll be selfish and take it. So, Sean, did you have a great birthday the other day? Yes. I got a message. Somebody subscribed on my birthday to the channel. And so that was an awesome birthday present. So I was like, it was good though. Yep. Even though I'm recovering, but I'm doing good. That was another question. So here's another one on the Moses thing, which I love the way you guys are thinking and trying to apply this, and you're doing it biblically. You guys caught on to exactly what I wanted, and I think what Doc wanted for you. So here's the question, Doc, is I think that, or it's sort of a question, sort of a statement, but I think that while Moses was with God, his credence was one, but fell when he came down the mountain. Is that possible? Even if we didn't say it was one, it was 0.99, whatever that is it possible? I think the point here that it went down after, some time. Is that possible?
Yeah, I think it's definitely possible. I mean, what do they say? Out of sight, out of mind, right? I mean, I think this happens to all of us. Like, we go to church and we're like, I'm going to do all these things. Like, God's amazing, God's real. And then, we just fall into the same patterns, unfortunately. And yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about a lot of those cases too is there are cases where our credence lowers, but we actually haven't lost evidence. It's just kind of irrational. And it's happening because, like I said, it's out of sight, out of mind. Maybe you get caught up in your desire for something that you shouldn't desire, whatever the case is. But that's another thing that you can think about is credences can go up and down irrationally. And sometimes that can lead us to really, really bad things. So if your credence that God exists or that Christianity is true is going down, but not because of evidence, but because of something else, that's it shouldn't, that's not a good reason for it to go down. So that's a really good point.
Oh, that's interesting, because now I'm thinking about it with dispositional or occurrent. Wow. Yeah. Thoughts, beliefs, would that affect? Oh, I could go on. Sorry, I don't want to. Sorry, guys. Those of you know what I'm talking about. You know where I'm going with that. So let me get to your questions, because you guys are awesome, and I want to make sure Dr. Liz gets as many of these as possible. So discussions that was addressed. Oh, from Roxby. We love you, Rox. She's one of our mods and supporters. Appreciate you, sister. What is an appropriate or healthy level of skepticism in relation to an appropriate level of certainty? What is the relationship between the two?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think, how certain or how skeptical you should be, this sort of comes back to something we were talking about earlier. That's going to depend on the thing in question, right? So what is the object of your belief or your faith or your credence, right? And then it's also going to depend on what evidence you have for and against that thing, at the very least. And there's background debates here in epistemology about, is it only evidence? Do things besides evidence count? The view called evidentialism says only evidence counts. People say, no, things besides evidence count. And I don't really necessarily want to get into that today, but it is true that most epistemologists think at least evidence isn't irrelevant. That's at least an important part of what tells us how high or low our credence should be, or how skeptical we should be. So yeah, I think it's going to depend both again on what the matter is, and then your evidence for and against, and potentially some other stuff, but that other stuff kind of gets more complicated. So, but
That's
great
awesome.
question.
Is that where pragmatic encroachment, and we don't need to unpack that completely, but that's sort of where that comes into play, correct? So that would be
Exactly.
how,
No, that's spot on. So
okay.
pragmatic encroachment, I'll just say it really quick for listeners. It's the view that not just evidence, but also what's at stake can affect how confident or skeptical we should be about something. So if you have the memory of being at the bank on a Saturday, and we're not in coronavirus times, so places have their normal hours, a lot of people think then you can go ahead and believe that the bank is open on a Saturday and plan to kind of cash a check there if you need to go to the bank tomorrow. But let's say your mortgage payment is due Monday. So if you don't get this check deposited by the weekend, you're going to default on your loans and go bankrupt. Then people will say, well, just because you remember being at the bank a few weeks ago on a Saturday, that's not enough for you to believe that the bank is open on Saturday, because look at how much is at stake. You could lose your whole house if you're wrong about that belief. So so then the debate goes on, and evidentialists will give a response to that. This is supposed to motivate the idea that it's not just about evidence, because in both cases you have the same evidence, which is this memory, but it's also about practical stakes. So that's a third component that I don't necessarily want to commit to here, but that view is called pragmatic encroachment, which means what you should believe and how skeptical you should be depends not just on evidence, but also depends on practical factors.
That's awesome. Thank you for packing that. And if you guys didn't catch why I asked that, let me just say, because you're going to hear the extraordinary claims requires extraordinary evidence. And that, I think, falls into this whole discussion. So that's why I'm bringing these questions up for you guys. So let me see. There's a couple more, and then we'll let Doc enjoy her Saturday. Let me see here. I know there was one or two more. Oh, I know what it was. So this was a little off topic, but I thought it was still a good question, Doc. And you don't feel like you need to, give a thorough answer this however you want. So the question was, what about God being logically necessary a ground for being, is the way it's phrased. But I think they just want to ask about God being a logically necessary being. Perhaps.
Yeah.
That's from Joel again. So I think that, Joel, if I've misrepresented the question, I apologize, brother. So does that make sense, the question, what he's asking?
Maybe. I'm not 100% sure. I guess what I'm trying to understand is, he said, but what about? And so I'm wondering what the thing he's referring to is. So
logically necessary ground for being.
He could be thinking, like, because God is logically necessary, we should have a credence of one in God's existence or something. I'm not sure if that's the question, but that's one possible way of interpreting it. Yeah. And some people do think that did I lose you? Okay, you're still there.
You're good. Yep.
Oh, okay, great. So some people do think, for necessary truths like 1 + 1 = 2, those are things we should have credence of one in. So I think the claim that we can, and not everyone agrees with this, but a lot of people think that if God exists, then God is logically necessary, right? But we can't, I would argue, depending on our evidence, but a lot of us, we can't have credence one in this proposition that God exists. So if we were certain that God existed, then it would be true that God exists in all possible worlds. But some people think, that, like Swinburne's view, for example, is that God is a contingent being. So God only exists in some worlds. But even then, I think we still have to have this debate about whether this necessary being exists at all. So it might be that there's sort of subjective and objective constraints on credences. And it is true that we should have, you could think about it like an unproven mathematical theorem, maybe. So one common one is Goldbach's conjecture, which is the sum of 2 primes is something. I forget what it is. But anyway, that thing is either necessarily true or necessarily false, right? So we should either have a credence of 0 or 1 in it in some sense. But because our evidence is inconclusive, right now we have a 0.5 credence in it, right? Because it's this unproven mathematical theorem. And the same thing might be true for God, right? Like, either it's true that God, if God's a necessary being, which we can maybe set Swinburne's view aside, then it's either, probability 0 or probability 1 that God exists. But because credences are sort of taking into account our current evidence, we might not, credences are subjective probabilities, they're not objective probabilities. So in the same way we might have a 0.5 credence in Goldbach's conjecture, we might not have a 0.5 credence that God exists, but we might not have a credence of 1 that God exists. So I'm not sure if that exactly answers the question, but that's at least one way you can think about it.
I liked it. So yeah, I think it was good. Even if and forgive us if that wasn't the question, brother. We're not trying to straw man you at all. There's a very charitable way of representing it, I think. So we'll take 2 more because again, I don't want to be mean and take up Doc's whole Saturday, be selfish, so to speak. But there was a question for me that was interesting, and Doc, you may want to tackle this too. Thinkers, if you have absolute certainty that God exists, does it make it easier to have faith in him? Well, yeah, I think so. If I understand the question correctly, yes. Now, let me say, because of certain experiences I've had, okay, in my life, in terms of crashing in a minefield, I think some of you may be familiar with that, and living, not only living, not one of us was injured at the time that occurred. And so to me, I was praying on the way down, and everyone and our chalk and all the aircraft that were flying together thought we were gone. They just thought, that's it, these guys are gone. They saw us falling out of the sky. No one thought we were going to make it. And there's a number of factors that go on, but just imagine in your mind, you crash landed in a helicopter in a minefield. What is the chance of you surviving that? If somebody asked me what my credence in the survival of that is prior to having been through it, I would say none. It's like 0-1, right? I'm very, very low. But so in terms of things like that and other experiences that I've had, and just always this sort of idea in my mind that there must be a God because of sort of Aquinas's fifth way, those of you guys that are familiar with that. It seems to me I have a very high credence in the fact that God exists. So it's going to take an insurmountable amount of evidence or something that's very, very true to overcome that. Doesn't mean it can't be done, because I don't want to be irrational, but it's also impossible for me to say in the way that Doc and I are talking about this, that I have a credence of 1 that God exists. However, if I did, because that is the question, if I had an absolute certainty and let's say a credence of 1 that God exists, would it make it easier to have faith in him? I want to say, yeah. What, Doc, is that?
Yeah, I think today I was going really hard on certainty, but I guess I'm not also trying to say it's a bad thing. I just kind of question whether it's actually possible, especially in this life. And again, there's that verse that says, now we know in part, but then we shall know fully. So maybe in heaven it's possible. But I'm saying that, yeah, but if you have really high credences, or even if you had certainty, that could help, that could really, be a good thing in your faith. I'm not saying that it couldn't, but I also think that doubt can be good too. And doubt can lead us to, like I said, pursue questions about why we actually believe stuff and really start thinking through our faith at the same time. So I guess what I was trying to push is that we don't have to hold up certainty as this Christian ideal. That doesn't mean it's a bad thing. That doesn't mean it can't help us in our faith. But it doesn't need to be the thing we're all striving for. What we should strive for is commitment. So I guess it's good to kind of clarify that. I'm not saying it's bad to be certain. I'm just saying I don't think it's possible, but it's not needed, even if it were possible. So
yeah, and if I've understood you correctly, I have the same views, the same mental states there on that. So sort of a metaphysical joke there for you guys, but yeah, so that it. Because I would agree, guys, we don't, A, certainty is very hard to achieve, but B, we don't need to have it. Okay. If we're being very, I don't know if pedantic is the right word here, if we're being very, very, very strict about what we're talking about here, and we're trying to be clear and be strict with it in that sense, but that doesn't mean you can't, if somebody said to me, I know something, I'm not going to go, well, as a, budding epistemologist, I have to question whether or not you actually know that. Or they said, I have certainty that God exists. I'm not going to question that, guys. The thing here for you guys as an application is more when you are receiving negative feedback from others saying you can, and they start explain to you why you can't be certain about things, that shouldn't shake your belief in God, your faith in God. And I wholeheartedly agree with Doc that when the ADD's kicking in again, that when she talks about how we have this these faith that we don't, I'm trying to think of how to unpack this. There's going to be a lot there. Well, let me just leave it at that. And if you guys have any other questions, I'll check. I think that's it for the questions. Doc, was there anything else did I left out or you wanted to say?
No, I mean, thanks. Those were really great questions. So thanks to everyone for those. That was some stuff that I'm going to be thinking more about too. You guys have challenged me and stretched me in a lot of ways. So thanks for the awesome questions. And yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just say, like Sean said, my website is liz-jackson.com, and I have a public philosophy page there. So some of you might be familiar with some of my work on Pascal's Wager, which was mentioned a few times today, but I've done some stuff on that and some other interviews on faith as well. I have an interview with Cameron Bertuzzi of Capturing Christianity. That's about 45 minutes, and we go into some of the same stuff we talked about here, but some different stuff too. So if you're interested in kind of hearing more about faith, that's another place you can look as well, where I kind of give some more of my views. So yeah, but thanks so much for having me on. I don't know if was there any other questions or anything, or
I just briefly checked, guys. Was there anything else? Please send it in right now. Put question, and if you guys in the chat could hold off. Oh, okay. Here's one. Yes. Can you describe your personal relationship with God? What is it like? So, interesting question.
Yeah, that's really open-ended. I mean, I can talk a little bit about, I guess, my background. But yeah, so I grew up in a Christian home. My parents actually worked in ministry. So I've been the kid of parents in ministry for a long time. And I think for a while for me, God was kind of, well, I was always a very inquisitive child. I had many questions about everything. And where did the universe come from, and all that, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think, especially as a kid, God was kind of an explanation of the universe to me, I guess. It was like, where did everything come from? Well, God kind of explains it all. But it wasn't as personal, I guess. It was kind of more like you said, God was this ontological commitment I had, but it wasn't, and I would pray and all of that, of course, but God wasn't, I didn't fully have a personal relationship with God. But I guess, especially through high school and through college, and actually I wrestled with like really serious doubts and really serious questions about Christianity. And part of it was a college professor that I had. I started off actually at a Bible college, and I had a college professor who I would come to with, I mean, he was kind of the most philosophical of the professors at this Bible college, but I would come to with lots of questions, and he would kind of just be like, yep, I have the same questions too. Like, I'd be like, what about the violence in the Old Testament? What do we say about that? And he was like, I have no idea. And I was like, whoa, this is intense. And I mean, in a way, I guess it's good he was honest with me, but I found out later, I mean, he was basically just on the path to becoming an atheist, and is now an atheist and has left the school and all that. So stuff like that was really hard, and I think really caused me to doubt and question a lot. But at the same time, motivated me to want to become a professor myself, because I know professors are such a big influence on students, and having a professor who has thought through these things and has, I mean, I'm not going to have all the answers. I'm not saying that. But having Christian professors, I think, is really crucial, both at Christian and at secular schools. So that was part of what inspired me to become a professor. So God used it, even though it was a really hard time in my life. So yeah, I think now it's interesting, because my work in philosophy of religion actually really has helped me personally with God. When I do have doubts, when I do have questions, I think some of the things I shared with you guys today show me that I can still be honest in praying and in reading the Bible and in seeking God, even when I have really serious questions. I mean, I do struggle with the problem of evil. It's really hard. It's something that I don't think I'll always have a good answer to, but I think that's okay. And I think I can be rational in seeking a relationship with God, even in spite of that. So one thing that I love about doing philosophy of religion is that for me, it's not just this abstract thing that it helps me solve philosophical problems, even though I do just like philosophical problems, but it also really does have personal significance and meaning to me, especially the stuff on faith, but Pascal's Wager too, even. So So yeah, that is a little bit more background on me. I guess the question was sort of open-ended about my personal relationship with God. So I hope that's at least some of what you were looking for.
Yeah, it was great. Thanks, Doc. And guys, yeah, please do go check out her work. It's brilliant. You've gotten a lot of praise, by the way, in the chat, just so you know. It was
Oh,
good discussion, and you were great on capturing Christianity too. And so we're all fans. And just so
thanks.
yeah, just so everyone's clear, I know I keep trying to be, and that's what philosophy in part does, is that when we talk about doubt here, I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget. That's where I lost my train of thought last time. Is what I hear Doc saying is that look, doubt is going to lead to good questions. It's, in other words, don't be afraid of doubt. It's okay. You're not a bad Christian. Okay, we all go through it, but in the end, on the back side of it, you have that doubt. It's all right to ask questions. You ask those questions, you're going to get answers. A lot of times, if you're being fair about the way you examine that data and that evidence, I think, at least it's been my experience and tons of other Christian philosophers and theologians' experience, that you're going to come out with answers, which is going to raise your credence, believe it or not. And then all of a sudden, when that question comes up or other things to do, you go, well, look, I've answered 99 out of 100 of these questions and felt comfortable with it. So when the 100th one comes, like Dr. Liz is saying, and I can't answer this with absolute certitude or a high credence, I'm okay with it because the 99 other ones I've got down. So one new one, unless it's a game changer, doesn't affect my faith. So that's what I think we want you guys to walk away with here. And we love y'all. Thank you so much for sticking around. And yeah, I think that's it. Unless you got anything else, Doc.
No, thanks again for having me. This was really fun. So yeah, thanks for everyone who tuned in. Yeah, this was a blast.
All right, guys, take care. God bless. Hang tight for a second, Doc, and we will talk to
Okay.
you soon. We love y'all. Let me see. Well, if I can end the stream, I will.